Thank you, Andrew. And good day, and thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, which is Rare Disease Trials, the Beginning, the Middle, and the End. Today we're going to discuss two primary topics. The first is a high-level orphan drug overview, looking at what is an orphan drug and a comparison of the existing regulations. And in addition to that, we're going to get into some best practices in rare disease trials, looking at what may be the beginning in natural history studies, the middle, running a rare disease study or program, and then the end, preparing for submission specifically with active studies. Now, I know from the registration that there is a mix of seasoned researchers as well as many of you who are newer to rare disease research and to clinical research in general. So I'm hopeful that there are key takeaways for all of you in today's presentation. So we'll begin just by looking at the foundations for the research that's being done and to touch upon the guiding regulations, starting with what is an orphan drug. So orphan drugs are medicinal products that are used in rare medical conditions which occur so infrequently that there is no reasonable expectation that the cost of developing and making the drug available will be recovered from sales for those drugs. As a result, sponsors are reluctant to develop them. However, with the passing of orphan drug regulations, there's now a notable financial incentive to encourage the development of drugs which otherwise would lack sufficient profit motive from these developing companies. So to review some interesting metrics regarding rare diseases and orphan drugs, I'll just touch on these three things listed here. First, there are about 7,000 distinct rare diseases that exist today, with approximately 250 new diseases being identified each year. Also, there are currently 600 new medicines currently in clinical trials. Approximately 200 of those are in phase 2, and the U.S. is the leading market for orphan drugs with 350 drugs in development. This is according to Kewick Research. So to look briefly at the regulations, I have a couple of slides comparing what those designations are in some of the countries that are advancing in this area. You can see here the comparison of disease prevalence for orphan designations, as well as the governing authorities and regulations. So the goal of these regulations was to make rapidly available for rare diseases drugs that have the same level of quality and equivalent to that required for any other drug. Looking specifically in the U.S., it was as early as 1983 when the Orphan Drug Act was signed by authorities, far ahead of other regions. This law, as do the other regulations, defines the orphan drug with regard to the prevalence in the American population for the specific disease. You can see by the table that the prevalence required for orphan drug designation in the U.S. is approximately 7.2 per 10,000 in the population. Interestingly, in the U.S., the concept of an orphan drug does not simply cover pharmaceuticals or biological products, but it also covers medical devices, dietary and diet products. In Europe, the Regulation 141/2000 on orphan drugs was adopted in December of 1999. It was actually largely inspired by the U.S. regulation. And then there was a second regulation adopted in April of the following year, in 2000, which established the provisions for the application criteria for the orphan designation. According to the European regulation, only drugs for human use can be designated as orphan drugs, so they do not include medical devices, do not include dietary products. And you can see here the prevalence is lower than that of the U.S. with approximately 5 per 10,000. Japan, another region for extensive rare disease research, there are special provisions relative to the research and development of orphan drugs that were amended by the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare for their pharmaceutical law, and this was done in October of 1993. For Australia, the orphan drug policy was set up in 1997 by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. The orphan drug designation in Australia is intended for drugs which aim to treat diseases with a prevalence of 2,000 patients or less in the Australian population, which is approximately 18 million. The main characteristics of what's called the Australian Orphan Drugs Program is also based on close collaboration with the FDA and in relation to the Orphan Drug Act. All of this further incentivizing companies to invest in the development of rare diseases, and as we've seen, there's been an increase in the industry for this research, including attention to what are considered ultra-rare diseases. So represented here are the incentives in each of these countries for an orphan drug designation. The incentives include an extended period of exclusivity, as is noted in the third column, as well as the possibility for waiving fees for applications and memberships, and substantial reimbursement of clinical trial costs in addition to grants and or technical assistance that may be provided. And just for further clarification, technical assistance meaning oftentimes clinical and preclinical consulting and study recommendations may be provided. So there is, as a benefit, a lot of dialogue and access to the regulators for people who are working in the rare disease space.